Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for What's Happening in Germany. My name is Evan Verplu, and I serve as the Program Manager of the International Relations Council here in Kansas City. We are very glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact in our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live today or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. IRC members are also warmly invited to join one or more IRC roundtables, which are a chance to connect with other members, talk about current events in regions of interest to them, and help inform IRC programming. Roundtable members will be invited to a quarterly meeting and receive IRC event information and other updates relevant to the regions they select. Roundtables are open to all members of the IRC, including individual and family members and individuals affiliated with IRC organizational members, like businesses, colleges and universities, and nonprofits. Be as involved as your schedule allows without worrying about whether you can make a meeting or meet a deadline. The point is to connect, explore, and engage. More information is on our website at irckc.org. We are also very pleased to be partnering on today's program with the Goethe pop-up of Kansas City. Their goal is to present contemporary German art and culture in Kansas City and help shape a current understanding of Germany in one of the Midwest's fastest growing cultural centers. The Goethe pop-up organizes a broad range of events and support projects in the field of arts, literature, music, film, theater, and more at their space in the Crossroads and with partners around the metro area. They aim to explore current issues from both German and US perspectives and collaborate with cultural institutions, artists, universities, schools, and businesses that have an interest in Germany and its language and culture. With so much going on around the world, it's easy to lose track of what's happening sometimes, especially in places that sometimes have fallen out of the headlines or where news stories are increasingly complicated. We certainly cannot predict the future, but we do know the importance of understanding historical background and current global context. No matter your level of expertise, the What's Happening series offers a meaningful explorations on some particularly active parts of the globe. We invite you to deepen your global knowledge and nuance your understanding of what's happening around the world as we explore what's happening in Germany. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions throughout the course of the conversation using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Christina Kohler is a business professional driving sustainability, marketing, communications, and innovation with experience in several sectors, including technology, finance, retail, and performing arts. A native Kansas Cityan and German American with family in former East and West Germany, she studied German literature and international relations at Dartmouth College and got her MBA from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill and resides in Berlin since 2012. Christina, thank you so much for being with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you, and herzlich willkommen to you all. Just wonderful to have you all in attendance for this special session on what's going on in Germany. And as we get ramped up, I just want to introduce now our special speaker, Emily Schultheis, who is a freelance journalist and recent fellow with the Institute of Current World Affairs, based between Vienna and Berlin. She is living, as well as I, in Germany and in Austria at the moment. So greetings from the continent. Emily writes primarily about German and Austrian politics and the rise of the populist far-right parties across Europe. Over the course of her political reporting career, Emily's work has appeared in a variety of very impressive long list of publications, newsletters, magazines, including the New York Times, Politico, The Guardian, the Associated Press, National Geographic, BBC Online, the Los Angeles Times, CNN, CBC, NBC, and even some very impressive German publications, including Der Tagesspiegel, Deutsche Welle, and the Spiegel International, among others. So we are very excited to hear what she has to say. From 2011 to 2017, Emily covered US national politics and elections from Washington, first for Politico and then for the National Journal and CBS News. She's also a previous recipient of the Arthur F. Burns Fellowship, the Robert Bosch Foundation Fellowship, and the East-West Center Jefferson Fellowship for her reporting on international politics and populism. A native from the San Francisco Bay Area, she graduated summa cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania. In addition to her journalistic work, she is currently studying for a master's degree in national studies at Central European University in Vienna. Indeed, just a few hours ago, she handed in her big papers and reports. So we're really thrilled to have her. And now, Emily, let's pass it on to you and find out what's happening in Germany today.
Thanks so much, Christina. In general, good evening from where I am and from where Christina is. Hope you're having a good afternoon there in Kansas City. And vielen Dank. Thank you so much for the invitation to appear at this in general. I'm very excited to hear tonight's discussion and to share some thoughts with you, and can't think of a better way to celebrate submitting my thesis than having a good chat about German politics. So I wondered, Evan, would you be able to share the first slide from I've got just kind of a small presentation just to sort of give you something to look at while you listen to me talk. So this is just sort of a general, we've got a map of Germany with the 16 different states, and you've got a Europe map that kind of shows Germany right in the middle here. And I just wanted to sort of give a bit of a visual as I get started. I think, there's a lot of different topics that I want to touch on tonight, and tonight. There are also all sorts of other topics that we can get into based on what you're interested in your questions, or delve into further. But I think sort of the overarching message that I would want to convey, and the thing that's become clear to me in the 5 years that I've been reporting on Germany, is that the country is in so many ways at a crossroads right now. This is a country that obviously has a very unique and oftentimes very complicated history, things that still definitely have echoes on the country's politics and society today. It's a country that plays a huge political and economic role within Europe. You see it there. It literally is sort of the center of Europe and of the European Union. And I think adjusting to some of the sort of responsibilities involved in that role, both within the European Union and also on the international stage, these are things that are very much kind of at the forefront for Germany right now. There have been some very big political shifts, I would say, over the last decade or so. We've had some of the similar trends that you're seeing to other countries in the West, other countries, including the US, in terms of the rise of a certain type of populist politics and the kind of, in some ways, decline of some of the traditional parties. And so, Germany is in so many ways at the forefront of these questions about what is its role going to be, what do its politics look like, what does its society look like, and sort of, what is the future? What does the future look like for Germany? So that I just wanted to start with as kind of my overarching comment for today. I guess the first thing that I would start with is, when people think about German politics, the sort of outsized figure of the last essentially 2 decades was the former Chancellor Angela Merkel. She became the country's first female chancellor in 2005. She left office after 16 years last December when a new government took office. And so I think that's the place that I would want to start. And I think the reason that there is such a big shift underway in Germany is because you had Angela Merkel was the head of sort of a center-right conservative party, the Christian Democrats. They had been running the party for 16 years under Merkel. And in this last election, which happened last September, that party lost quite a lot of support without Merkel leading the ticket. And instead, you saw a brand new government, an unprecedented 3-party coalition government, come into office led by the Social Democrats, which is sort of the center-left party within Germany. Evan, could you go to the next slide for me? All right, so this is just so you've got a bit of a visual. The slightly shorter guy right in the middle is Olaf Scholz, and he has been the Chancellor of Germany since December. To his, I guess, if you're looking at this photo, the two people on his left are Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck, who are the leaders of the Greens party. And so it's not the first time that the Greens have been in government, but it is sort of a moment where you're seeing their focus on environmental issues and their kind of position as this new up and coming party. They've really seen significant gains in the last couple of years and are playing a really unprecedented role on the national level in Germany, which I think has some potentially interesting impacts on kind of the future of policy, and particularly the future of climate policy and environmental policy. But I think in general, just, you know, with foreign policy and a handful of other issues, they're really they're bringing a new voice to government and at a level of influence that they haven't had before. And then the third party involved in this government is the man standing to Scholz's right from what you're looking at. That's Christian Lindner. He's the leader of the Free Democrats, which is sort of a liberal in the European sense, so kind of neoliberal party, which is a bit more sort of financially conservative, but has managed to find, you know, these three parties have somehow managed to find significant common ground to come together for the first time in a three-party government. And, you know, thus far, I think we've seen they put out kind of a roadmap for what they'd like to do. And there were definitely some differences. You know, there's been a movement to vote to increase the minimum wage. There are new policies on climate issues that are being discussed. And, you know, this kind of brings me to the next thing that I want to talk about. You know, foreign policy is very much something that this government wants to talk about differently. And, you know, they came into office in early December, and a few months into their tenure, you have a war break out in Ukraine when Russia invaded in late February. And so all of a sudden, this government has sort of been really put foreign policy on the forefront, whether they had hoped that that would happen or not. And so, you know, you see a new government coming in after 16 years of one leader who really, you know, under Angela Merkel, she had sort of been seen as this kind of key figure of stability within Germany and within Europe. And, you know, you have a brand new set of leadership come in, and just a few months later, you have this unprecedented situation in Ukraine, which has really forced everyone in Europe, I think, leaders across the continent and even beyond, to really respond to that and figure out what the united response should be. And so that brings me kind of to my next main point about some of this moment of transition that Germany is in. Germany, as you saw on that map, occupies this, you know, not just geographically, it does occupy this sort of central space within Europe, but I think symbolically, economically, politically, it also occupies this space. But Germany has in the past, due to its history in the 20th century, has been somewhat reluctant to take on a leading role in Europe, which I think, you know, I think most people would argue that Germany has indeed been filling that role in some form, whether it intended to or not, in recent years, whether after the financial crisis or the influx of refugees into Europe, or the pandemic, or now the war in Ukraine. People look to Germany on these things. And so whether they are reluctant or eager to embrace that role, this has kind of been one of the biggest questions about what Germany is going to look like in the future, and sort of how Germany fits into this international space. And so the war in Ukraine was really a pivotal moment for Germany on this front, because they have traditionally held themselves back. For example, they didn't, you know, they had a policy of not providing weapons in war situations. They had a policy of they were reluctant to spend a significant portion of their budget on defense spending. A lot of these places where some of their international allies have sort of asked them to step up in the past, the country had been reluctant to do so. And then the war broke out, and all of a sudden, in really a matter of days, you saw Germany say, we're ready and willing to supply, or to allow our weapons to go to Ukraine, to actively supply deadly weapons in Ukraine. And Chancellor Scholz gave a speech at the end of February saying, he essentially called it sort of a change of the times, that this was sort of a moment where Germany was going to change its policies. It offered to or said that they would be investing significantly in defense, which is something very new. And so you had this moment where overnight, Germany sort of embraced parts of this role that it had kind of long rejected, and the road since then has not been easy. And I think you're seeing Scholz and you're seeing some of the other leaders really struggle with kind of how to balance what Germany is used to being on the international stage when it comes to foreign policy, and what the reality of the situation is, and what's sort of being expected of them by others. And so this is kind of this moment where, you know, the two politicians from the Greens that you see to his left, Annalena Baerbock, who's currently the foreign minister, and Robert Habeck, who's the sort of economy and climate minister, have really taken on sort of a new outsized role in light of that. So that brings me, speaking about Habeck, brings me sort of to another topic I'd like to just briefly touch on, which is Germany's economy and climate change, and how these things will come together in the future, in the coming years. And I think, you know, it's worth noting that this new government, because the Greens are involved, because the Social Democrats have vowed to also make significant progress on some of these climate issues, you do see for the first time a government that's come in that doesn't want to take sort of half steps. It's a government that is very intent on making significant investments and on making significant changes, which is a tough thing for a, you know, sort of massively industry focused country like Germany, a country with a huge automotive industry, and a country that still does depend on coal for its energy production by quite a lot. And so, you know, interestingly, also this situation in Ukraine has prompted further discussions about how Germany can make itself energy independent and can be relying on renewable energy and sustainable energy going forward. But these are discussions that I think have been really driven home in the last couple of years with some of the sort of climate events we've seen. There were some really, really deadly floods in Germany last year that I think made people recognize this is not happening elsewhere in the world, this is happening in our backyard. And so that, combined with this current situation in Ukraine and the question of whether Europe, or how Europe could possibly reduce its reliance on some of the energy that it gets from Russia, these are really pivotal questions that the country is facing going forward. And I think questions, you know, again, this issue of Germany being a leader, whether it intends to or not, I think with the Greens in government, there's a lot of Europe that is looking to them to sort of see what happens next. And so, again, speaking about this political change, I think, you know, I touched on this briefly at the beginning, and could you, Evan, go to the next slide for this one? About this issue of sort of the shift in a political landscape. So what you see here, so Zweitstimmenanteil essentially refers to, it's a very complicated electoral system, but this is sort of the vote percentage that each of the major parties gets. And so what I've got here is something from 2013, when Angela Merkel's party was very dominant, and when the Social Democrats were still quite a large party. The other ones were all fairly small. The far right Alternative for Germany did not make it into the parliament. And then if you look down at the bottom, the second graph is from 2021. And you see there that this sort of, there's kind of a leveling of the playing field. And it used to always be in Germany that there were two major Volksparteien, so people's parties. There was one that was sort of center right and one that was center left. And those parties still exist, the CDU and the SPD. They're still there. One of them is still leading the country, but it used to be that they had, you know, between the two of them, such a huge dominance over politics. And now you're really seeing the system get a lot more fractured. And so I mentioned that this is the first time that there's a three-party government on the national level. It's because no party, you know, no two parties really have enough votes to make a government together like they've always done in the past. And so this is such a big question, I think, going forward in Germany, is how, when you have six parties in the parliament, none of them really able to have kind of that strong position to build a strong majority like in the past, how does this sort of affect the way that the country governs going forward? And you know, watching this current government with three different parties is definitely kind of going to give us some clues as to how that looks in the future. And then I guess if we could come to the last image, there's just a few other things that I sort of wanted to touch on that to a certain extent actually have to do with some of these questions about the political system. So what I have here is a map of the purple countries or the purple states are the former West German states, and the orange ones are the former East German states. And I think, when we speak about the shifts in the political system, a lot of that has to do with the very different voting patterns between the East and the West. And, Germany has now been reunified for more than 30 years. And yet I do think there are a lot of sort of discrepancies that you see between the East and the West in terms of incomes, in terms of representation in politics or in the media. And there's also a very, sometimes very starkly different voting pattern, particularly in that these two big people's parties are not very strong there. And the far right Alternative for Germany, or AfD, is in two of those 6 states, including Berlin. In 2 of those states has now become the largest party, when in the West it often doesn't get above 10%, sometimes not even above 5%. And so, you have this situation where there is a far right party in Germany. This has kind of been my primary focus in the last 5 years, is looking at the impact that they have. You've got this far right party that on the national level only got a little above 10% this last time, and yet it's getting close to 30% in some of these Eastern German states. And so, considering there are already some divisions that remain even 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fact that the politics are also so starkly different is maybe in some ways a reaction to some of those enduring differences, and also a reflection, I guess, of some of those enduring differences. And so that's one thing that I think Germany is kind of really, since this 30th anniversary, has spent a lot of time grappling with. And I guess the last thing I want to mention, because I think, and I'll get to this kind of in closing, I think that there are sometimes similarities between the questions that are being asked in Germany and the questions being asked in the United States. But one thing that I think has also been really interesting to follow in the last few years is this question of sort of what is German identity, and how is this changing in light of, for example, more than 1 million refugees coming into the country, or in light of, there were millions of guest workers coming from a whole host of different countries, primarily Turkey or Spain or Italy or Portugal, back in the 60s and 70s, who now have kids and grandkids who've grown up in Germany, who maybe don't sort of look like what people would imagine is kind of the traditional blonde-haired, blue-eyed German, and yet very much consider themselves German and have grown up in the country and have sort of also impacted the way that the country looks today. And so one of the most interesting things for me, I think, in light of some of these bigger questions about Germany's role in the world and the political shifts that have happened, is sort of how is society changing, and how are attitudes toward immigration and integration changing, and what does it mean to be German? Because I think we all, people have kind of a preconceived notion of what German might be, and that might be true in certain parts of the country or in certain situations, but oftentimes being German might look very different than we would assume. And I think it's really been fascinating watching those conversations unfold. So I guess just in closing, I just want to say, coming to this as an American who's primarily writing for American audiences, you obviously naturally have to sort of keep an eye out for what might be parallels between the two places that I know and the places that I've spent time, and how, I guess, what's interesting to an American audience about what's happening in Germany. And I think maybe this has come across during some of these things that I've mentioned, but the longer that I've been over here, the more convinced I am that there are a lot of parallels, whether it is, this question of far right violence, of conspiracy theories and disinformation. There's a lot of the same kinds of sort of coronavirus related movements, or sort of anti-COVID measures movements that you would see across the US. You see the same kinds of things in Germany. A few months before people stormed the Capitol in the US, people tried to do the same thing in the German Bundestag. And, this question of how do you prevent political violence or sort of extremist violence is a huge question. And so, some of those things I really do see, if not direct parallels, I see some sort of Ähnlichkeiten, some similarities. And And I think it's been really interesting to watch, my home country and sort of my adopted country wrestle with some of these questions about how do we go forward on these issues? What does it mean to be part of our society and to belong to our country? And sort of how do we make sure that everybody is being brought along on that? And what does the sort of role in the world look like? I think that's something that the United States has also very much grappled with. So I'll finish with that. I'm very much looking forward to any of your questions. And yeah, thanks again for having me.
Well, thanks so much, Emily. You might want to unmute yourself because we're going to have this nice little conversation for the. You've covered a lot of important and I'd say holistic topics to give a good overview as to where Germany is today. And I'd like to maybe follow up on that, just go from the last point of the German identity and how it's changing. Generations are, of course, also different. And for those back in the US, often young people don't even know anymore where the difference between East and West were. So I think that's also a very important point to take home. I moved to Berlin 30 years ago for my studies and then now came back 10 years ago and have definitely seen a difference in the face of sort of diversity in the newsrooms and the media, so much more integration of multi-ethnic backgrounds and names, all speaking German fluently. Clearly they're German, they've grown up here, and the integration of that has been so effortless in that aspect. But now maybe my question, so there has been a lot of talk since the wave of the refugees from Syria and from other places as well, now with the Ukraine, on providing financial resources specifically to foster integration in order to kind of alleviate any kind of tensions that might come up. Can you share a little bit, maybe, I don't know if you could share a little bit about your perspective on how this integration has been successful, perhaps in certain locations, rural versus city, east versus west. There's always success stories and some stories that not have been successful, but love to hear your perspective on those integration program resources.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it has been. I think in Germany there's sort of been, at least in the German media, there's often been a bit of a focus on the negative instances of this, which definitely exist. You have had situations where people who've come as refugees have ended up committing crimes or, doing other things that very much wouldn't count as a success story. And yet sometimes those individual stories overshadow the fact that, at least from what I can see and from what experts I've spoken with have said, is that actually this has gone remarkably well, considering how many people came in, considering the fact that at the beginning Germany was not anticipating nearly the number of people that they got. And so, I think it's a bit of a patchwork situation where you have exemplary stories and you have less exemplary stories. But I think on the whole, in my conversations with refugees that have come, particularly those, I would say, from Syria, from Afghanistan, the ones who came kind of under this very specific type of asylum, you are provided with a great deal of resources. You do have the opportunity to attend German classes. You are helped with finding placements. And interestingly enough, I think sometimes the people who are placed in smaller towns have ended up, if you have a town that really is rallying around that, it means that you very quickly become part of the community. And I think that's, there was one story, for example, about a very small town in Eastern Germany, where there basically weren't enough kids, German kids, to have a school anymore. And it ended up being refugee children who were the sort of deciding factor in being able to keep a school open. And so, that's just one small example. But in general, I mean, I've met a fair number of refugees who, especially younger ones, who come here, they very quickly learn the language, they very quickly feel like they're part of the society. And then it is just this question of, it's got to be a two-way thing. And so sometimes that is also a question that people raise is, if they're in a community where they feel that the rest of the community is very eager to have them and to help them, then this process happens much faster. And sometimes that is the case, and sometimes it isn't. But in general, I would just say, you know, Merkel gave this very famous statement now in 2015, wir schaffen das. So, you know, we can do this, or we'll manage it. And that's often kind of it's often been the key word used by far right parties, saying, you know, well, everything's gone terribly and we obviously couldn't manage this. But in general, I think the things that we've seen in the last, I mean, I guess now almost 7 years, would indicate that on the whole, it's going quite well.
Yeah, you know, I think the social services that are given to not just Germans, but to non-Germans who come to Germany, also from other European countries, is quite incredible. And there's that idea of keeping the balance, sort of political. I mean, I've never felt so safe in any city before than in living in Germany. Largest city, Berlin, just don't have that same feeling as I would in certain US cities. And yet it is a balancing act, is it not? You know, this role kind of moving into sort of the role of Germany in the Ukraine. Of course, there's been an evolution to this, right? Germany now has the, I guess, acknowledgement and support of the international community, I would say, thanks to the reputation and the way that Angela Merkel led the country, that in fact is also very much embedded in the European context. Given the history of Germany, it has always been a focus, right, to have Germany play the role, foreign policy role, always as a mandate for Europe, never a mandate for Germany. And it has always had a special relationship and led the European relationship with China and Russia, as well as with the US. And so it's interesting now to see there's that unique balancing act with this increasing challenge of far further moving right neighbors within the European community of Poland, Hungary. How do you kind of, can you share some thoughts on this balancing act? And do you think that, what could the United States role maybe be in helping to support that a bit?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and one that we're seeing unfold before our eyes at the moment. You know, it's interesting. I think my answer to this would have been very different 6 months ago. Obviously, a lot of things looked very different 6 months ago. But you know, when Merkel left office, I think there was this idea of her as the person holding Europe together, and this idea of sort of a pragmatic foreign policy that also kind of went hand in hand with Germany's economic interests. And that has been one of the parts of her legacy that I think has come into harsher light since the war broke out in Ukraine, because there are sort of, you know, Germany, we speak about kind of Germany being the voice of Europe, or trying to sort of be the voice of consensus in this situation. And yet there are situations, so there's the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for example, which was very much something in Germany's national interest, but something that was deeply contentious on the European level, that, you know, Germany kind of has attempted to maintain sort of some sort of middle ground with Russia in a way that ultimately has made it harder for them to stand up to Russia now, and I think has been a bit different than some of the other European allies that are now kind of trying to sort the situation out together. So that's one space where I see some issues with sort of the long-standing policy in Germany coming into conflict with what we're talking about now. But I think it's not just Russia. I think, you know, when we speak about human rights in China versus, you know, maintaining economic interests with China, I think, you know, you mentioned some of the sort of European neighbors that are perhaps moving a bit to the right. Germany has quite a lot of economic interests in Hungary, which makes it a bit more difficult when, you know, the leader there, Viktor Orban, is doing some stuff that very much challenges the rule of law and pushes back on a European level. It makes it really not easy for someone like Germany to sort of tell him off and to react strongly to that. And so it's a huge balancing act. And I think in the time since Scholz gave this big speech at the end of February, which everyone was just sort of astonished that Germany could move so much in such a short period of time, he's kind of walked parts of it back a bit, or has struggled to maintain it, and has very much sought to find this middle space, this balancing act, and you kind of get the sense that he's not always succeeding in that in the way that maybe was possible before the war.
Yeah, I mean, I've always found it's been a unique challenge for Germany, not because of the history of having to be more careful on how to do foreign policy, but also because it has 9 neighbors. I mean, it is the country that has the most neighbors, and so most internal exchange on needing to find negotiations and solutions there. Interestingly, just for our audience to note, the Nord Stream was also sort of pushed because Angela Merkel, after Fukushima had the nuclear disaster, just made a very quick decision to get out of nuclear energy, which is of course adding all this pressure now. Where France continues to, have theirs, and that's of course the industrial state of Germany is of course very important to keep upright there. So I just want to, I've got maybe one more question for you, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and maybe tapping into this energy topic and climate change topic. I think perhaps interesting for our friends in the US is that Fridays for Future is a huge movement in Germany. And they have representatives just as popular as Greta Thunberg. And this Fridays for Futures movement really kind of gave the wings, or put the wind in the sails for the Green Party in this last election. So another interesting thing, while Chancellor Scholz, an SPD Social Party Democrat, when he came into office, changed the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy to the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And I think that's an important message to note because of that focus on there. And there's a strong movement. I personally came back to Germany because the green jobs, the sustainability jobs, which is what I'm in, are more prevalent here. Do you sort of have some observations that you can share as to how do you think Germany will progress in this green economy? What can the US learn from it? Does the US need to be worried about this? Or is the US going to just, wake up, or has already woken up and move forward, take over in the green economy movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And it is, since I've been back, or I've been in Germany now on and off since 2017. And I do think that there is both in my personal life and in listening to politics, there is definitely a difference in the way that that these things are discussed, and a difference in the urgency with which these things are discussed. And I think part of the reason that Germany will be very interesting to watch on this going forward is that, look, in the US we have a 2-party system with a very divided Congress. It is, despite the fact that you have a Democratic president in the White House, a Democratic House, and with the tiebreaker, a Democratic Senate, passing real, solid, legitimate climate legislation is very difficult under the current political conditions. What you see in Germany is you've now got a coalition that not only is open to these kinds of things, but is actively, you have a party involved and in fact leading this ministry, who is actively behind the push for stronger legislation, for more job creation and whatnot. And I guess, so the one thing I would just sort of note, you have in the southwest of Germany, you have a state, Baden-Württemberg, which is where Stuttgart is, which is, kind of the heart of the automotive industry. And for now, I think 10 years, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's 10 years now that it has been governed by a Green politician. And he is wildly popular there. And, ahead of this last federal election, I spoke with some of the politicians from that state just about, you know, oftentimes when you're kind of an idealistic party, you come into government and you're all of a sudden faced with reality. It's like, here's what you want to do and here's what you can actually do. And essentially, you know, it was interesting to talk to those politicians because they said, we feel like we've actually worked out a really good balance with this industry that you would think would be totally opposed to having the Greens, where they kind of have found, they figured out a pragmatic way to get a lot done, including in a state where you would not necessarily expect that. So I think that's kind of one example of a state level thing that we've seen in Germany that might be interesting to see kind of how those same dynamics play out on the federal level.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. This the traffic light or the multi-party does require you to take those needs into considerations and can move you forward. Perhaps it'll be an interesting sort of race to watch between Europe and the US on this. So thank you so much. I have a few great questions that our audience members have shared, and maybe I'll just pick up the last one first from Jeff. How has German public education systems, how have the German public education systems adjusted during the shifts in political philosophies over the past years? So what are the prospects for the future?
To be totally honest, I don't know very much about that. So I might have to sort of decline to answer on that front. I've not spent a lot of time covering education policy.
Maybe I can just share a little bit that there's been less and less investment actually in the public education system. So there's always a PISA study and report to see how, you know, the country's educational levels kind of rate, and Germany, unfortunately, for a number of years has been sort of on the lower level there. Whereas university, of course, is still, that's sort of at the high school level. But I'm not sure if the shifts in political philosophies are related to the more far right. I think one thing that many don't know is that the Holocaust and the history of Germany is an essential element that is really covered in quite depth throughout the educational system. I wish that the US would do the same with our Indian and African American history. But so I'm sorry if we didn't quite hit the mark on that one, but let's we gave it our go. So let me see. Here's another one. Given Germany is 25% of the EU GDP, what do you think the impact of the Ukraine invasion will be on the German population support, commitment to East European security in Europe, actually forming a full defense force, land combat power, building a large effective German army with German population support, or not necessarily outsourcing modern defense to the US, UK, or Nordics? So can you give that a go?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a complicated question, and it is difficult to see exactly how this is going to go. I think some of it depends a bit on how long this war goes, which obviously no one knows at this point, and sort of the way that things progress. There's a huge number of wildcards right now on this question, but I think you are already starting to see some of the fault lines emerging. And you know, there is this question. I think at the beginning you saw a huge outpouring of support from the German population for the large number of Ukrainian refugees coming in. You saw Germany very quickly, actually in ways that it didn't with Syrian refugees, really seek to streamline the process to make it very easy for people to come to Germany and to find a place. And so in that sense, you know, I think the overarching support for Ukraine has been quite strong. I do wonder in the long run, particularly because it is so tied up with questions about energy, and you're already seeing energy prices rise pretty significantly. I do wonder a bit kind of how this will progress in the future among the German population, because I think it's in some ways very easy to say that you are completely and utterly behind, you know, a full sort of backing the backing the Ukrainian war effort, and then being faced with the reality of how that, actually impacts your daily life. And this is frankly the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing in countries like Hungary, who have essentially sought to sort of take a step back from what the European Union is doing, saying that they want to kind of protect the interests of everyday Hungarians. And that's totally the argument that the far right makes in Germany as well. So all of this is to say, I don't know. And I think some of these questions are very open. We get to next winter when some of the energy questions will become more dire. And I will be very interested to see how that discussion continues. I mean, if we want to speak more on the defense policy level, this is, I think, comes back to what I said earlier about Germany making these very public, notable shifts, and then struggling to a certain extent to sort of back them up with actions, or muddling the message in ways that have detracted from that very early, strong shift and strong commitment. And so I think Germany it's not going to happen overnight that Germany sort of overcomes some of its misgivings and some of its sort of nervousness about these ideas of a European army, of building up its own army. I think those are all questions that are being moved forward, but it is definitely, it feels like a situation where you can almost see kind of 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Yeah, maybe from my perspective, I could also share, I think there is a bit of a difference if you have a European immigrant versus a Middle Eastern, Northern African immigrant. It's just a cultural, perhaps more cultural openness, and there's just more in common, perhaps also culturally there. So I think the other aspect that plays in is that it is so close to home. I mean, it is a 3-hour drive from Berlin where the war is happening, and there are enough people, still elderly people around, who remember the war and look at the buildings, and so they can relate on that aspect as well. The third thing I might just add is that folks are, from a society perspective, you're against these things when you feel that you're paying for someone else and you're not getting a benefit. Which also, by the way, happened when the wall came down, and the East was getting all this, and the West is like, why, right? But what I wanted to say is that the first wave of and problems of dealing with the Syrian immigrants or the other immigrants, trying to get them jobs. It was difficult. The bureaucratic system, as Emily has said, has just gotten so much easier and faster. And a number of people have already been hired and getting jobs. So that takes away this, you're sitting sort of on the dole and getting money for me. And I think all these elements play in the aspect of the military. After the fall of the wall, Germany kind of did get rid of the requirement, I'm missing the English word, but the requirement to go to military service. And there are conversations now about should that come back with the increased, perhaps, threat or different world order. So, but thanks. That was a very full and complex question. So thank you for sharing that. Maybe we could go into the next question from Mark, which is more about the voting patterns. How you mentioned that there's a difference in voting patterns between people from East Germany and West Germany. Can you go in on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and reporting on. And of course, it is also deeply complex, and it's hard to sort of to generalize to any one or even handful of factors. But I guess it was 3 summers ago, I spent a month living in Garlitz, which is a sort of medium-sized city, small to medium-sized city in Saxony, right along the Polish border. So the easternmost city in Germany. And the reason that I went there is because they came very close to electing the first far-right mayor of Germany. In 2019, the far-right candidate there from the AfD won 45% of the vote, and the party consistently wins upwards of 35 or 40% there. So it's definitely sort of a stronghold for the far-right. And in any case, the reason I mention that is because I think that, I think Görlitz is a very helpful microcosm to think about some of these issues. You've got, you have a lot of people who were maybe not so young when the wall fell, but were not old when the wall fell. So people who perhaps had graduated from university, had done trainings, had started working, and there was this sense that the fall of the wall was going to mean this completely different world for them, was going to mean huge opportunities, was going to mean mobility, was going to mean an economic standard of living that they were not used to. And so I think part of what's happened, people actually have described it to me this way, and I think I would largely agree with this, that the reason that the far right is so strong in the East has much more to do with the period from 1990 until today than it does the period from 2015 until today. And so, I could give one example of a couple that I spoke with while I was there. They're sort of, I think, in their early 60s, and had a small business and had basically said, we were so excited when the wall fell. We were so happy about all the opportunities. We built a small business here. 2008, business went under. The wife had to go into early retirement, and the levels of retirement, levels of pension are also different in the East than in the West in a lot of cases. And, they were basically saying, we're both in retirement now and we have to ask our kids for money. And we don't understand, first of all, we were really disappointed that this was the way that these went, because we spent our lives building up this business. We wanted to build up the East. We stayed here for a reason. And then you saw refugees coming in 2015 and 2016, and they kind of saw that as, I think it was more the sort of catalyst for stuff that was already sitting under the surface. This idea that, okay, well, these people from far away are coming here, and why is it that the government is paying attention to them, and why is it that they're getting this help when we feel like we've been crying out for help for a long time and we haven't gotten it? And so, so they voted for the far right, and not out of any, strong, deep sort of conviction for some of the far right political positions, but I think there was, and still to this day remains, a fair bit of, we're going to do this because we need people to pay attention. We don't feel heard by any of the other political parties when we voice what we are feeling about some of the way that we've been treated versus the way that refugees are being treated. We're being called racists and Nazis. And this is a party that doesn't say that. And it's also a party that is sort of says that it will change things. I mean, they very much played on some of the rhetoric of the 1989 protests to kind of build themselves as, we are the new party that is standing up for your democratic rights in the face of this government that doesn't really care about you at all. And so, I think a lot of that stuff comes together, and it is, when a party has been around when it has reached the sort of level of support that the AfD has there, it becomes socially acceptable to vote for them. And you see the city councilman around town, you say, oh, my neighbor Lutz is a member of the city council from the AfD and he's a good guy. So, these national guys say this crazy stuff, but how bad could it really be? And we want to send a message. And that's where I see sometimes occasionally some parallels with the US, but yeah, so in any case, that's a bit of a long answer, but it's all to say that I think there's a lot of factors involved, and I don't see them changing anytime soon.
Yeah, no, I mean, excellent explanation for that. And also that protest vote, right? But actually, it's interesting because we have another, I'm just going to piggyback off that. If you can go a little bit more into the differences and similarities between the far right movements in Germany and the US. The audience member shared that one difference between the two that comes easily to mind is the use of religious rhetoric and religious justifications in the US that doesn't seem as pronounced in Germany. Doesn't even come up actually, I think. But how are Germany and US far right movements playing off of each other, and what platforms are they strengthening in each other, would you say?
I think that's a great observation about the difference in religious rhetoric, and a great question about kind of the interplay between the two. In terms of the differences, yeah, I think that's a huge difference. In the United States, you have the religious right as sort of a key tenet of the support for the Republican Party, and you see the reflection of that in some of the political positions taken. And in Germany, to the extent that you see something, it's not even, it's never really religious. It's more, there are kind of cultural arguments being made by the far right. So you do see some discussions about sort of traditional family. At the same time, one of the party co-leaders is a gay woman. So I think that kind of pushes back a little bit against the sort of traditional, not that it changes the overall policy of the party, but it's kind of interesting, I think, to me that you see people leading this party who maybe wouldn't fit the ideal of what you would expect. And you do see it a bit in the sort of, they would speak about sort of Judeo-Christian values, society, etc., in contrast to many of the refugees who've come from the Middle East, because they would essentially say that Islam is not compatible with, sort of certain aspects of German society and culture and whatnot. And so to the extent that there's any religious aspect, I guess that's what I would say. In terms of the playing off of each other, I think, interestingly enough, some of the messaging kind of knows no linguistic or political borders these days. And I would give just one small example, which is that obviously there's a certain rhetoric in the United States about the legitimacy of the 2020 election, speaking about, voting machines and all of this kind of stuff. And I was in a small town in Saxony ahead of the election last fall and had a local voter from this little rural town say to me that he's heard about the Dominion voting machines in the United States from Telegram, and that he's afraid that the election will be rigged in Germany because, well, I know we have these same voting machines, and that's, there's clearly some bigger conspiracy. And so, I did not expect to hear about Dominion voting, which is a very United States kind of focused issue that's been pushed by Trump and some of the others, some of his allies. And yet you see that, I think, sometimes even one-to-one, these messages have made their way across the Atlantic.
And there you see also that, which I think a lot of Americans don't realize, is that the world really does inform themselves about what's going on in the US. There is a lot of coverage on what's going on in the US and Germany. And you sometimes, of course, media plays a certain role in that. But in any case, I'm going to jump to, we have 3 more minutes. I just kind of want to give the last person who has the question here, what would you say are the key components of environmental conservation and energy transition in Germany? So like neighbors like France seem to continue valuing nuclear energy. What seems to be the focus in German policy? And I can just share for myself, because I'm in the sustainability area, that there's a huge focus on liquid natural gas and green hydrogen. Germany wants to become the leader in green hydrogen. They're doing partnerships with Qatar and other countries to move that along, but perhaps you have something else to also, and wind, of course, and solar is the big focus. But
yeah, I mean, I think you probably know some of the ins and outs of this better than I do, so I'm glad that you also shared. I think the biggest difference is this nuclear question in some ways, because it makes this was one of the few decisions that Angela Merkel has made that was maybe not sort of a long, gradual, over a huge amount of time decision. This was a fairly snap decision on her part, and it really has meant that Germany is having to come up with a different equation for sustainable energy sources than countries like France next door. So, I mean, the question of coal and dependence on coal is a huge question in Germany. There's a planned exit from coal in 2038, I believe, and the current government wants to move that forward. But yeah, I mean, I think these are, removing nuclear from the equation was a political decision at the time based on a lot of uncertainty about the safety and worries that something like Fukushima could occur in Germany, but it has meant that this is a much more complicated equation as a result.
Yes. Well, there's still so much more to say, but we'd like to thank you for attending so far, and I'd like to pass it back to Evan and the IRC.
Well, thank you so much, Emily and Christina, for taking the time today, your evening, for taking us through this program. As you mentioned, this could go for another hour easily. So we appreciate your wonderful insights and all the time and energy that you took to present this program today. Thank you so much, everyone who took a little bit of time out of your middle of the day to tune in today. If you'd like to revisit this program, it should be up on our YouTube page here probably by the end of the day. You'll be receiving an email with that link to our YouTube page. If you'd like to know anything more about the IRC or get involved with any of our future programs, you can head to our website, irckc.org. And we also thank the Goethe Pop-Up for partnering with us on this program. Again, thank you so much, everyone. Christina and Emily, thank you again, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Thanks so much for having us, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.